Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you all for being here. And thank you for coming to the first of our series of Reaffirming University Values, Campus Dialogue and Discourse. My name is Richard Locke. I'm a professor here in political science and international public affairs and currently serve as provost. Now, this initiative, the Reaffirming University Values, is sponsored by both the Office of the Provost as well as the Office of the President, and includes engagement of many others on campus, academic departments, centers, and also the Division of Campus Life. And the intention through this series, which has different lectures and workshops and other things, is to basically do what universities should and must do well, which is to apply rigorous scholarship and engage in thoughtful, informed discourse around society's most pressing challenges. So the goal is to do teaching, to do high-quality research, and we hope out of this teaching and research to promote solutions to some of our most pressing challenges. Now, at one level, it sounds quite simple, right? All right, just do research and teaching, and maybe you can solve the big problems in the world. But we know that, in fact, it's much more complex, and these challenges are much more profoundly difficult than initially we think, especially around some of the very charged issues that most need attention, like issues of race, issues of discourse across differences, and things like that. And we are delighted to be launching this series with Professor Jelani Cobb, and many thanks to the chair of the American Studies Department, Matt Gooderl, for helping us bring Professor Cobb to Brown. Professor Cobb is a scholar, renowned public intellectual, and exemplifies exactly the kind of approach that we're trying to promote and reinforce and strengthen here on campus around dialogue across people with different perspectives, different backgrounds, different points of view around some of these most pressing issues. Jelani Cobb is a highly accomplished historian with expertise in post-Civil War African-American history, 20th century American politics, and the history of the Cold War. Prior to joining Columbia University's School of Journalism this past August, he was an associate professor of history at the University of Connecticut and director of the Africana Studies Institute. He is the author of several books, including Substance of Hope, Barack Obama and the Paradox of Progress, The Devil and Dave Chappelle and Other Essays, and To the Break of Dawn, a freestyle on the hip-hop aesthetic, which was a finalist for the National Awards for Arts Writing. He was also a recipient of fellowships from both the Fulbright and the Ford Foundations. Beyond these scholarly achievements, Professor Cobb is perhaps best known for his contributions to The New Yorker. And if you haven't seen some of the recent pieces, they're absolutely fantastic. I was just talking about one that came out in the last issue of The New Yorker around millennials and the way that they see politics, which I thought was great. And he's been writing for The New Yorker since 2012, and he joined as a staff writer in 2015. He is prolific on issues of politics, history, and culture, and writes eloquently on the enormous complexity of race in America. He authored a compelling series of articles about race, the police, and injustice, which included the article, The Anger in Ferguson, Murders in Charleston, and What We Talk About When We Talk About Reparations. In 2015, he received the Sidney Hillman Prize for opinion and analysis journalism for his New Yorker columns. And when he was presented with this award, his New Yorker colleague, Hendrik Hertzberg, praised Cobb, noting how fortunate the magazine was to have found, quote unquote, this great new voice. A voice, in his words, that combines the rigor and depth of a professional historian, the alertness of a reporter, the liberal passion of an engaged public intellectual, and the literary flair of a fine writer. In its statement about the award, the Hillman Award jury wrote, quote unquote, "No one has done a better job of placing the events in Ferguson and similar happenings in other places like Sanford, Florida, Cleveland, Ohio, and Staten Island, New York, in their broader context than Jelani Cobb." noting that through his unique perspectives as historian, reporter, and writer, and subtle moralist, he was able to meet the challenges of describing the turmoil in Ferguson in a way that cut through the frantic chaos of breaking news and deepened readers' understanding of what they were seeing, hearing, and feeling. We are delighted to have Professor Cobb with us tonight to discuss his craft, fuel our thinking, and to share his views on A Note from the Margin, the Unsafe Spaces of Democracy. Please join me in welcoming Professor Cobb.
Good evening. So I want to start by giving my thanks for the invitation to Provost Locke and also to Professor Rose and I think Professor Gutierrez here somewhere as well. Oh, I think he's in a meeting, but I wanted to acknowledge him as well. I'm very happy to be here with you this afternoon. This is my third time in Providence, and somehow the first time I've actually gotten to Brown's campus. So in this case, the third time is the charm, and I'm very eager to have an exchange and dialogue with you all today. So we're in a period of time in which we've seen a great number of questions and a great deal of debate and protest and going back and forth on our college campuses in the past year. We saw protests here at the University of Missouri, at the University of Connecticut, where I was a professor at the time, at Yale, at many other institutions, around kind of similar fault lines. And these fault lines had to do with race. They also had to do with academic inquiry and freedom of speech and lots of things that I want to make sure that I talk with you all about this afternoon. But if we can start broadly and then work our way in to a more discrete discussion, I think we'll be well served. So I read a book recently called The Hunt for Vulcan by Thomas Levinson. It's an interesting book, although if I give you the description of it, it probably does not sound like it. It's a book about the change from Newtonian physics to Einsteinian physics, and about the various debates and complexities that went into unseating Newton's ideas about gravity and its relationship to the cosmos. And so just on the surface of it, it's like a bunch of scientists arguing with each other. My equation is better than yours, like the academic version of rappers battling with each other of some sort. But in actuality, it winds up being a deeply informative and insightful examination of human nature and some questions that I think are pertinent to us today. So, the 17th century, when Isaac Newton publishes Principia and proposes that there is this discrete mechanical way in which we can understand the universe and that it is all based upon gravity, and that if we understand the size of an object and we understand that gravity is a constant, we can therefore project out to the ways, the mechanics of the universe. And it is a watershed moment in human understanding that for millennia, untold, humans have looked toward the sky in utter bewilderment and not understood the relationship of themselves to the stars or what lay beyond the stars. And then all of a sudden, Newton proposes this idea that says that the world functions in a way that is rational and that it follows particular mechanical laws, and that if you apply these laws accurately and appropriately, you can predict the behavior of the natural world. And this is important because it influences other ideas, like the ideas that human societies might actually be intelligible in the same way, And that if you found the right principles and the right mechanics and the right formula, that you could create an orderly society out of the chaotic human day-to-day interactions of humanity. And this is fundamental to our pursuit of democracy and the Enlightenment. And so there's a relationship between these two bodies of knowledge. Except there's a problem. There's this kind of nagging small disparity that we find again and again. And the predictions, according to Newton's theories, that the cosmos should behave in just a particular way, but these celestial bodies are not quite where they should be. And they may be just off a little bit. And the problem, of course, has to be with the application of the theory, not the theory itself, certainly not the theorist. And so this persists for 2 centuries, more than 2 centuries. And Einstein comes along and proposes his theory of relativity, which says not only is gravity not a constant, that we can only understand the world in relation, the natural world, in relationship to other objects. We can only understand one object in relation to itself, to another object. That gravity is not a constant. And time itself, in the most kind of mind-bending concept, that time itself is not a constant. And so we only understand these things. If we want to understand one object, we have to understand its relationship to something else. And so this has implications. When I looked at this, it had implications for the ways that I see the world and the work that I do and the things that I think about a great deal. Because when we look at our theory of democracy and our belief that our Constitution could prescribe and be a formula for an orderly democratic society, we see that the objects, the bodies, are not quite where we think they should be. If we looked at the outset of this country, we would say that those bodies were on farms and plantations. And if we looked at the beginning of this country's rise and the foundation of its economy, as a kind of wonderful book Ed Baptist wrote, The Half Has Never Been Told, where he talks about the role of slavery as being foundational in the American economy. We see that those bodies are disproportionately in places where they are enslaved for the purposes of producing profit for other people. And if we see in the aftermath of the institution of slavery that those bodies are disproportionately found to be incarcerated or put to service on chain gangs, the ancestor of the modern mass incarceration economy that we have now. And so I say this to say that our values do not exist in absolute terms, that we only understand our values and we only understand our democracy in the relationship of one person in relation to another. That like Einstein's unseating of Newton's ideas, we don't have an absolute mechanism for understanding ourselves or the country. We only have a relative way of approaching ourselves and the country. And that universities are not absolved from this, that universities reflect very much the values. And we talk about our values as an academic institution or the values of universities and higher education. We typically talk about the support of open inquiry, of rigorous intellectual analysis, of dialogue across differing opinions, of the kind of open pursuit of questioning what we believe we know or what we know. And these are foundational to the university and what we think of as our values. But the universities are not removed from the values of society themselves. If we were to talk about, not to single out this august institution, but we know that it has a very close connection to the history of slavery itself. Or if we were to talk about the august institution where I am employed, across the street at Barnard College, and recognize that F.A.B. Barnard was the president of the University of Mississippi, who during the Civil War allowed for the creation of regiments of university students from the University of Mississippi in order to fight for the defense of the institution of slavery. Also, kind of ironically or paradoxically, Barnard was one of the earliest advocates for equal access to education for women. And so the very retrograde ideas that he was responsible for promoting at the University of Mississippi are kind of in contrast to the egalitarian ideas that he was responsible for promoting at the college that came to be named after him. Or University of Alabama, which was constructed by slave labor. Or we could kind of go through this long list. Craig Stephen Wilder, in his book Ebony and Ivy, does a great deal to further our knowledge about the relationship between the institution of slavery and the institutions of higher education. And so our values don't exist in a vacuum. Our institutions don't exist in a vacuum. And so we should not be surprised to see that at a point in which we have great tumult and turmoil and conflict, and the ways in which race has become a critical factor, an unavoidable element of American society in a way that we have not been forced to confront until we were all walking around with cameras and we could literally record what we're seeing happening as a kind of testament to the way in which race exists in a society. Until we reach that moment, we would not we could actually avoid, or part of the society, a portion of society had the option of avoiding the resonance of race. And so for what I do as a writer and as a journalist, I've had a particular window into this series of events. For the New Yorker, I've written about Trayvon Martin. I went to Ferguson, I went to Charleston, I went to Baltimore around the circumstances of Freddie Gray's death, and look into the circumstances of Freddie Gray's death. I've written about many of these flashpoints that have defined the Obama era and the ways in which race has been reconfigured and its implications. So we should not be surprised to see these kinds of dynamics emerge and to be present on American college campuses. As a matter of fact, even at the University of Missouri, which is only not very far actually from Ferguson, this was a direct relationship between students who had, young people who had learned to organize and become activists in the context of Ferguson, and then looking and confronting the same sorts of questions and problems that had emerged or confronted them on their own college campuses. And so one of the other things that was notable to me, I thought was informative or instructive, was that last year, in which all this was happening, was also the centennial anniversary of a film called Birth of a Nation, which you may have heard of. And so Birth of a Nation, the classic of American cinema, depicts, if you haven't seen it, it depicts the rise of the Ku Klux Klan and the aftermath of slavery in the midst of Reconstruction, and kind of heroically portrays them reinstituting the subjugation of Black people, particularly Black men, and proposes a, when we talk about Birth of a Nation, D.W. Griffith's film, we typically talk about the overt racism that he displays there, that is kind of showcased in the film. And whenever I talk about that film, I always say that I'm not nearly as disturbed by the racism as I am about D.W. Griffith's way of prophetically predicting the way in which whiteness would play itself out over the course of the 20th century. What he says in that film is that white Northerners and white Southerners, and this film was released on the 50th anniversary of the end of the Civil War, white Southerners and white Northerners could reconcile themselves. The lingering animus of the war could be ameliorated if they joined together around their mutual contempt for the Negro. and that this could be the cement, this could be the basis of this new reconciliation. This is largely the way that this plays out. If we look at what happens in the midst of the Great Migration or earlier, when African Americans begin leaving the South, and then we begin seeing Southern-style race riots popping up in various locales in northern cities. The NAACP, as a matter of fact, owes its existence to the fact that there's a race riot in Springfield, Illinois, the home of Abraham Lincoln. And people were saying that we're now seeing northern racism become increasingly similar to the southern variant of it. And so this is what Griffith proposes. And at the time that it comes out, it is tremendously controversial. One of the fledgling NAACP's first actions is to organize protests of the film, saying that this film has dire consequences for a population that is already marginalized and subjugated. The film is shown in the White House, and it gains this kind of rapturous following. And it also was responsible for the rebirth of the Ku Klux Klan, which had essentially died out as an organization in the 19th century. And so D.W. Griffith's film reemerges, and the Klan reemerges on the heels of it. And so these are the dynamics that are at play here. The following year, Griffith produces a film called Intolerance. It comes out in 1916. And people look at the film as he talks about, in the film, it is an examination of people who have been killed as a result, throughout history, as a result of intolerance. Intolerance is one person for another. And people have misread that film. They thought that it was his attempt to make recompense for the terrible racial violence that had been unleashed in the wake of his earlier film, Birth of a Nation. And so just as a quick point about the impact and influence of Birth of a Nation, the ritual of cross burning emerged as a product of D.W. Griffith's film. It had not, prior to the film, been a part of the Klan's rituals. But D.W. Griffith conceived of this as a kind of cinematic device for the film, and the Klan adopted it itself. So there's this kind of direct relationship between the Ku Klux Klan and this film. And so the following year, he makes this film called Intolerance. And in it, he depicts all these scenes of people being killed as a result of intolerance, and people read that as Griffith trying to make amends. But they couldn't have been more wrong. That film was not directed at the intolerance that had resulted in the rise of the Klan, not directed at the intolerance that had resulted in the lynching of African Americans, not directed at the intolerance that had created a now national policy of Negro subjugation. It was directed at the intolerance of the NAACP for protesting his earlier film. And so this is really the dynamic that I want to talk about here. In talking about how we function and the values of universities, we have had a kind of double bind. There are those of us who have been concerned primarily with intolerance, and those who have been concerned with intolerance of the intolerant. And so this has been a dynamic that we've seen play out kind of time and time again in these kind of flashpoints that have emerged on college campuses. So I think there are 2 points here, relatively narrow and discrete, and I'll say them and we'll kind of walk through them. The first is that in a hierarchical society, even liberties can be used in ways that reinscribe hierarchy. Even freedoms can be used in ways that deny freedom. And the second is that very often we refer back to our liberalism or our concerns about one principle as a means of deflecting our concerns about another. And so, to the first, very straightforwardly, when we look at the Bill of Rights, and we think about the protections and freedoms that are the product of the Constitution, a Constitution that we should point out already enshrines a particular racial hierarchy through the Fugitive Slave Clause, through the protections of the slave trade for 20 years, and also through the 3/5 compromise that says that all people of African descent in purposes of taxation and representation shall be counted as 3/5 of a human being. So the document itself begins with a particular kind of racial hue. But then there are other elements that on the face of it seem to be abstract or universal, but in the relativistic context of race actually take on other connotations. And so what do I mean by that? For one, the Fifth Amendment guarantees of due process, which is a cornerstone we believe in now, Fifth and 14th Amendment now, but the belief that you cannot be deprived of any of your rights without due process and so on. And so this is not something that we find to be objectionable. But in the context of American race and American history, it becomes one of the leading bulwarks against the emancipation of African Americans. So the belief that the federal government does not have the authority to free black people in the context of slavery is anchored in the idea that the country does not have the right to remove one person's property without due process or recompense. And so it's noteworthy that in this context, the Emancipation Proclamation is issued as a function of war, that in the circumstance of war and under the War Powers Clause, the president has acted in this way to kind of abrogate this Fifth Amendment premise and institute freedom. And so we've seen more contemporary examples of this in the Fourth Amendment, the Second Amendment. We have seen the kind of ways in which the belief in the untrammeled right of gun ownership has at the very least created complicated circumstances in the society. Depending on where you fall in this equation, you'll see that there are vast numbers of people who wind up as victims of gun violence, and those people tend to be people of color, far disproportionately to whites, and that our policies of allowing the society to be flooded with firearms have very different implications for a rural, middle-class white person or for a black person living in an urban or challenged environment. And so walking through these dynamics, or more recently, even in the case that we saw in Indiana just recently, where the First Amendment right to protection, religious protection, was invoked as a means of rationalizing and justifying the discrimination against gays and lesbians. And so looking at people who are in subordinate positions in society, even the ways in which our freedoms exist, can be used in ways that are undemocratic. And does this mean that we should get rid of these freedoms or we should curtail them? No, it doesn't. But it means that we should understand as a kind of democratic maturity that we don't all have the same relationship to the Constitution, that these relationships are relative. And so in American history, we encountered these questions kind of previously. In 1940, there's an interesting situation that occurs where there's a gentleman by the name of Chaplinsky, who is a Jehovah's Witness and who is advocating for his religious beliefs on a street corner, gets involved in a conflict and argument with a police officer. He calls the police officer a, quote, goddamn fascist, and he is arrested. Now, we kind of wouldn't think of this as being particularly incendiary. I called someone a fascist this morning, actually. I'm kind of involved on Twitter. If you have Read anything I've tweeted, it's like probably fascist once an hour. I will give you probably 3 guesses, although you only need one, why I have been so concerned with fascism in America of late. But Mr. Chaplinsky calls this a police officer a goddamn fascist, and he is arrested for the use of profane language, and he challenges the arrest as a violation of his free speech, and the Supreme Court actually upholds the arrest, saying that there is language that is so devoid of any redeeming quality that actually constitutes what they called fighting words, that you are using language that doesn't in any way kind of augment our democratic discourse. Do I agree with entirely? No, I don't, this concept, but it's still worth establishing that we do recognize parameters around the ideas of free speech and what circumstances in which we find free speech being used in ways which are intrusive or harmful to other people. We have libel laws. We can't simply, something very pertinent for the arena in which I work, both arenas. And so I should say this at the outset, that my critique is lodged as a person who works both in media and in academia, 2 arenas in which I literally could not function without the protections of the First Amendment. And it's from that place that I actually raise these questions about how we understand the First Amendment and how we understand freedoms and what our different relationships to them are. And so, and now I went on my tangent and forgot my point. Anyway, I'll come back to it. So I think that one of the things that we have to be mindful of in this conversation is the implications of our differing relationships to this idea and this term of freedom and freedom of speech. And so in our daily life, we go around saying that we cannot simply say there's shout fire in a crowded theater. We cannot simply say without evidence that Donald Trump is. It's just so many things I could kind of scroll through. But were I to say that Donald Trump was an unscrupulous businessman who was responsible for ripping off many people and should be in prison, in kind of specific language, I'm not saying that, but were I to say that, given the litigious nature of his enterprises, I would probably be brought up on, I could expect a libel suit in my direction. And so we have boundaries. We have a concept that language in itself can be injurious in certain contexts, but we are reluctant to extend those boundaries in particular social circumstances. And this is difficult. And so last year there was an article that came out in The Atlantic called The Coddling of the American Mind. It was written by Greg Lukianoff and another gentleman. And Greg and I have actually gotten to be friends. We've kind of had conversations. We've debated this point back and forth, but I kind of criticized him where I said that the concern about the fragility of American students and their belief that they shouldn't have to be exposed to anything that offends them is kind of belittling the fact that it's not simply a matter of being offended, the right to be free from things that offend you, but the correlation between these offenses and actual dynamics in the world. So it is not simply to say that we should not we should be more tolerant of someone who makes a comment that may be sexist, were it not for the fact that there are actual institutional structures and actual social attitudes that enshrine that sexism into a set of circumstances that produce differing outcomes in life for the people who are being subjected to it. More specifically, it is one thing to make crass sexist commentary. It is another thing to fail to recognize that commentary contributes to a climate in which women are raped and then made to feel accountable for the wrong that has been perpetrated against them. A study last year found that about 2/3 of African American students, actually just over 2/3, 67% of African American students have some encounter with racial hostility during their time on a university campus. Over the course of the 4 years in higher education, about 2/3 of these students encounter some sort of racial bias. I don't know if that data actually accounted for African American students who were at HBCUs and less likely to encounter a circumstance like that, but we can still say it is a common experience for African American students to encounter this kind of dynamic and this kind of situation. In that context, it's not coddling to say that we should be mindful of these dynamics. And last year at Yale, the conflict emerged from an argument over whether or not the dean should say that, Halloween is coming up, as it is now. Maybe you don't wear blackface. Maybe you don't do the kind of ethnic stereotyping, because what we do know is that this is not simply a matter of free speech. It also correlates directly to the retention of students of color on college campuses. And so when we look at the research of people like Claude Steele, the psychologist who's talked about the stereotype threat and the ways in which people are their outcomes and their performance is mediated by the additional burden that they bear about what the perceptions of them, stereotypical perceptions of them are. And so for the African American who walks into the room already feeling burdened by the idea that perhaps people believe that African Americans are not equally capable, the person who says you're only here for affirmative action adds an additional burden in a way that doesn't translate, were we to say this from in the direction of a group of people who have not had their humanity challenged in these ways. And so these are not kind of complicated ideas, or these are not controversial ideas. But I feel like we often talk past each other. We talk in the language of racial innocence, in which we are eager to cast off any association with anything that could possibly be point to us as having an unfair advantage. And so my good friend and undergrad classmate, Ta-Nehisi Coates, we had a conversation about this once, and he said, I really get intolerant with people who say things like, that was a long time ago, it had nothing to do with me. And he was like, well, so was the American Revolution. And he was like, but that doesn't stop you from claiming your identity as an American. We're eager to say, like, we are Americans, we're heirs to this particular element of this history, far less eager to say that we're heirs to the kind of social disparities that began at the outset of this country and have played themselves out in various ways ever since then. And so we look at the 27% of women, by some estimates, college women who will have been in some way experienced some form of sexual assault. We look at the 67% of African American students who find themselves and experiencing some form of racial bias over the course of their 4 years. And our response is to, rather than grapple with that, to assert the idea of free speech. And so, as a person who believes both in free speech and is vehemently opposed to bias along the lines of gender and race, I think that this is a kind of false disparity, a false difference, that we've kind of bought into a diversion where we say, don't look at what this hand is doing, only look at this hand here. And we play this dynamic out time and time again. Now, with that said, I think that it's also worth noting, before I actually move on, it's also worth noting that just as in the case of the majority of women who do not report instances of sexual assault, the majority of students of color do not actually report these instances of racial bias. And so we have this kind of dynamic in which on one side people believe that people are talking about race and they're complaining all the time, and on the other side there are people saying, you don't know the half. That were I to actually complain every time something happened, we wouldn't be able to get into an entire conversation. You'd be like, hey, wait, you did it again. And so, in this context, I think the University of Chicago, which is interesting, where it kind of released that letter earlier this year, where it announced its terms, which is basically like, toughen up, this is what you're gonna get here, that kind of Marine Corps type of tone to the letter. It was like, don't expect us to be friendly. And I was like, wow, this is really terrible customer service. It's like, I'd like to have an establishment, open a restaurant where I say, like, we're not gonna get you your food quickly. It'll probably be cold. The waiter is going to be an asshole, but hey, we're telling you up front, so come anyway, welcome. But what I mean by what I found it to be interesting in that was that I found an interesting point of accord with it, in that I don't believe in safe spaces. And what I mean by that is this, kind of in this language we say that people want safe spaces, they want to be coddled, they want to be treated with the utmost of delicacy and so on. And when I looked at these circumstances and kind of the anger and protest that emerged on college campuses last year, and I had conversations with peers of mine and said, we would never have protested those things, my generation. We wouldn't have protested them. And it was the general accord that we probably wouldn't have. And the reason for it was that few of us felt that these institutions belonged to us in the first place. That is to say, we anticipated hostility, and we did not feel that we were full shareholders in the institutions and places where we attended. And so if we were we were the recipients of racist behavior, it was kind of par for our expectations. The protests that emerged on college campuses last year actually have a kind of curious upside to them, which is that this emerged from people who actually believe that these institutions can be better, that they have a stake, and that these institutions can function in ways that are closer to what we think of as democratic. Now, at the same time, I wrote something last year about Hank Aaron and my admiration for him. And so I'm kind of a marginal baseball fan. I grew up in Queens, near what was then Shea Stadium, where the Mets played, and played baseball as a young person, and so I've kind of followed the sport in some kind of way. But that doesn't really have any connection to my admiration for Hank Aaron. My admiration for Hank Aaron stemmed from the fact that when he broke Babe Ruth's home run record in 1974, he did it under the most adverse circumstances imaginable. That toward the end of the 1973 season, when it became clear that he was on the verge of breaking Babe Ruth's all-time home run record, he began to receive death threats and all manner of hostility. When he took the field, there were instances where people threw black cats out onto the field as a means of distracting him or penalizing him or ensuring that this record would belong to the kind of great white athlete who had held it previously. And even, I should say, as a quick aside, we're in our language of meritocracy, where we believe that much of the resentment is directed at African Americans for quote unquote being given things that they don't deserve. One of the downsides of the Obama presidency is the irrefutable fact that, establishing the irrefutable fact that even when you are the most qualified, that does not absolve you from being penalized purely on the basis of race. And so when we saw Hank Aaron in 1973 come this close to breaking the record and then have to come back for the 1974 season and absorb all of this hostility over the course of that time period between those two seasons, and then begin playing again with the same burden. This is exactly this. It's a response to someone who, under the same rules, who has worked hard, has had no advantages, has simply moved up through the ranks and is about to achieve something, and it has provoked the same sort of animus and resentment. And so when he hits his 715th home run in 1974, he did it in the unsafest of spaces. That he did it by triumphing over people who had attempted to derail his progress in every way that they could imagine. My father was a boxer, actually. My father was a boxer, my grandfather was a boxer. I grew up to be a writer, go figure. But one of the things that he said that I picked up from my father was that the punch you're most vulnerable to is the one that you'll be hit with the most often. So it was like you calibrate your defenses so that you learn how to navigate. And so if you're susceptible to left hooks, that's what you're going to be hit with all the time. It's kind of the history of Muhammad Ali's career. Great fighter, great athlete, but he could never get out of the way of left hooks. And that was what he was hit with, his great nemesis and adversary, Joe Frazier. And so this is what happens, and the metaphor I think that I'm going with here is that I think there's something to be said for existing in circumstances that can be better than they are, existing in circumstances in which that fall short of being actual democracy or reaching the goal of democracy. And at the same time, protecting your defenses from the metaphorical left hook. That if there are, in fact, individuals who do not wish to see you perform well in these institutions, it's of little benefit to tell them exactly what your biggest vulnerabilities are. This is a difficult charge, and it's not fair, and I make no allusions to saying that it is, but it is the same challenge that generations of people prior to us have confronted. And so in believing in summation, in believing in the right to free speech, and in believing in the right to open inquiry, and in believing in the importance of an arena in which we talk across differences and dialogue across sometimes heatedly different perspectives, we have to be careful not to reinscribe those same relativistic ways in which we have fallen short of democracy. That's the challenge that has confronted us at the beginning of the society, and that is the challenge that confronts us now, and is a challenge that I am optimistic enough to believe that we are up to. Thank you. So we can have some questions and exchanges here.
Hello, my name is Fidelity. I'm a student here. I'm a huge proponent of safe spaces because, so for example, I'm in the Active Minds Club here. I'm in the Feminist Club. And I would argue that having that safe space and feeling comfortable talking about issues of sexism and issues of race and issues of mental illness in those safe spaces make me stronger when I leave it and make me able to be a stronger person and understand it more outside of it. So I don't know, how would you argue against that in this community, it's not like the safe space needs to be always. having it for a temporary moment and then being able to leave it and become stronger outside of it.
I think that you're right about that. What I mean by that, though, is that what concerns me is the idea that the safe space becomes like base during tag, like I'm here. And I understand the temptation for that. But I also understand that there's a kind of false security that comes with that as well. So one of the things that I did as a young person was when I had to start forcing myself to read the views of people who I opposed intellectually. Sometimes people who would there was no justification for the view except that this was an example of racism. And then to move beyond that and say, well, what are the intellectual underpinnings of this? What are the vulnerabilities of this argument? What is the faulty presumption that the person makes here? And the thing is, that kind of engagement that ultimately sharpens the sword. And so I think that is crucial. Now, is it important for you to have places where you understand? Let me just give you an example of this. In graduate school, we had a situation in which me and a good friend of mine, Khalil Muhammad, who's the just director of the Schomburg, he and I had a discussion. We were the only two African Americans in the room, and the discussion literally was about whether slavery was wrong. I mean, this was the term of the debate. And at first I thought this was a joke. And then I realized that I was in a room with people who were willing to debate whether or not slavery was wrong. And so it meant everything in the world for me to be able to look across the table at him and know that I wasn't crazy. That was important. But in that moment, I also said I'm going to remain steadfastly engaged in this discussion. I'm not going to get up and walk out because that's a particular kind of victory. And I'm not going to retreat. I'm not going to simply say, well, Khalil and I are going to have a conversation about this afterward, which we did, certainly did. It's 20 plus years later, and I'll sometimes call him up and like, man, do you remember that day? we were actually saying, no, slavery is wrong. And so to give a little bit more nuance to it, the question was whether or not people could be reliably expected to understand that slavery was wrong at the time of the Civil War, which was a contention that we thought was, yes, people could know that it was very reasonably, they could know that slavery was wrong at this point. But I think the dynamic here is to make sure, the other part of it is that we're existing in hostile environments. And I think that the likelihood of it becoming less hostile comes from us making that initial confrontation. And so with Hank Aaron, who did this in the context of not having any kind of space to fall back upon, once he achieved this, there was nothing that could be said. It was like, you can't there's no asterisk associated with what he achieved. He did it under these circumstances. So no, I'm not diminishing the importance of having people recognize who you are and what the similar struggles are. But I am saying that I'm calling upon us to be more resilient, those of us who encounter these sorts of circumstances, to be resilient in the face of them.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
My question is about a piggyback on that one, but I came from Spelman for undergrad and I'm in graduate school here at Brown.
Mm-hmm.
And so my safe space, I broke in undergrad in spaces that were protected and people that loved me, and so I come from a very different place of privilege in saying that I was able to engage with the text that actually broke me in those kind of conversations in rooms with people who loved me too. And so when I teach and I'm trying to have these conversations with students, I never acknowledge that they did not come from that same space, that they are 18 and struggling with these same texts that I struggled with in a room full of Black women who were gonna affirm my intelligence and affirm who I was as a person in doing that. And so you had that as the same experience in graduate school. So how?
Well, at Howard as an undergrad.
But you had this conversation about the legitimacy of slavery in graduate school, coming from a place of never having felt intellectual, or for me at Spelman, I had never felt intellectually vulnerable until I came to Brown, but I knew how to handle it. I was grown, I was affirmed, and I knew if I needed to cry, I could go and cry to my Spelman sisters who loved me. And so how do we have these conversations with undergrads and affirm their humanity and affirm their ideals at the same time that we are trying to teach them about the real world, and that they won't always feel safe, and that you have to break sometimes in order to rebuild in these kind of spaces?
Yeah, I think that that's important. So for me, when I was in that class, I wrote 2 words on the top of the sheet of paper, and the 2 words were Paul Robeson. This was at Rutgers University. Paul Robeson was one of the most distinguished alum of Rutgers. He was the son of 2 slaves, and he graduated from Rutgers as the valedictorian. Not only was valedictorian, I think he had 8 or 10 letters in sports. And so whatever achievement you could make at the school, he achieved. But I needed that for myself to say, people have faced worse. We're having a hypothetical question about whether or not slavery was wrong. This was a dude who was talking about my parents were slaves. And so I think that understanding that, and for me, being a historian, I look at these things and say, in the relative context, I think that there are bigger struggles behind me, and that I'm looking at this as having a tailwind, not a headwind. And for me, this psychologically, that was important. I think that's something that we have to instill, certainly in young people who are learning to exist in these environments. But the other thing I have to say is this. Having gone to an HBCU, it didn't immunize me from the kind of bigger currents. It was certainly important, but there had been 18 years of my life prior to that where I had absorbed all these kinds of ideas about what the limitations and expectations were of people who were black in the society. I wanted to be a professor. I literally did not know any black people who were professors. I met a woman who was a professor when I was 17 or 18 years old. And I was like, really? We did that? We do that? Oh, okay. And I think that is, it's important that we're there to kind of explain and kind of model what the possibilities are in these contexts. But I also think that we should not go into them anticipating the best. I think it's prepare for the worst and be happy if things are better than that. It's a kind of optimistic pessimism. Yeah, in the t-shirt, white t-shirt. Oh.
You alluded to the Lukianoff cover story in The Atlantic, and I was just wondering if you could elaborate a bit more on your thoughts about that piece.
If I could elaborate a bit more about what?
Just what your thoughts about the piece and its arguments.
It's an 8,000-word piece. It talks about, and I encourage you to all read it. And as I mentioned, Greg and I have had this debate, and actually, in some ways, he kind of wins on the fact that we've argued about this in a very civil way, because he's kind of arguing for these civil exchanges about things we disagree about, even disagree about vehemently. But nonetheless, we've had this conversation, and he knows like my criticism of it, which is that the piece talks a lot about the kind of emotional overreaction, but it's some of them which have happened on college campuses. But it's a kind of reductio ad absurdum approach to it, by pointing to the most ridiculous examples that, the student who says we shouldn't have tacos in the cafeteria because it's cultural appropriation, like that person, as opposed to saying, well, that's on one end of the spectrum, but we also have blackface on this other end of the spectrum. And it's very different to be having this conversation as a person of color, if you are of Latino descent, while we're actually talking about building a wall on the southern border of this country. That there are actually things these tie to, is not simply in the kind of abstract sense. The other part of it is that I tend to be hesitant to take the kind of psychological diagnosis approach to what's happening on college campuses, because it could easily dovetail into a kind of gaslighting where you think that this is something, or people convince you that there's not a thing that actually is a thing in front of you. And it kind of reminds me of the affliction during slavery that they conjured up of drapetomania, which, the illness which caused enslaved black people to irrationally continue running away. And so it reminded me of that dynamic, because if you're a person who's enslaved, it makes perfect sense for you to have this reaction, like, I don't like these circumstances, I'm going to leave. But if people who have power decide that this is irrational, then all of a sudden the reasonable thing becomes something that we talk about as this psychological phenomenon that needs explanation. And so I think there's a danger to doing that, and that we overlook things that we are actually complicit in, or we minimize things, where we'll see something that is outside our range of experience, but we want to explain to people who have actual experience with these things that we know it better than they do. And I don't absolve myself from this, right? So I always have to kind of talk to myself, because when someone points out an instance of sexism, not even something that I may have done, but something that's sexist in society, like, my instinct is to say, it's not. No, it's not. Because I, as a man, don't want to be associated with the group of people who do these things. But the more mature approach to this is saying that I can actually be a man and disassociate myself with the elements of my identity group who are perpetrating these behaviors. That I can actually step outside that and say, I dissent from this. I'm not part of that. And I think that that is kind of the mature approach that is lacking. Very often we remain kind of mired at that wasn't racism, you just thought it was. Even though I have no experience dealing with racism, I've never experienced racism in my life, but I can tell you what it is. You as a person who has to navigate an experience and figure out how to grapple with this circumstance as a part of your daily life. There's a bunch of folk. Oh.
Hi, Jeleni, this is a great talk, thank you. A lot to think about. I wondered if I could add a dimension and see what you might do with it, particularly in thinking about the context for the skirmishes around not just freedom of speech, but around student expectations, around institutions, and putting a sort of post-civil rights era racial lens. I mean, we're similarly positioned in age, where we weren't really in college when colorblindness was all the rage and the absolute sort of ideology about race. But I think it's an important context for both the kinds of tools students may or may not have around race, because it has been a kind of uneducation about race for 40 years pretty intensely. And the second matter is that all of these dog whistles around freedom of speech feel very much about talking about power, not just about race, but talking about power without acknowledging it, right, in what we call power neutral terms. So I'm wondering if colorblindness as a potential framework for thinking both about the generational divide, or gap, not divide, but the generational gap in perception of expectations, but also about the way in which it is fueling a sort of a way of thinking about freedom of speech that, as you point out, actually reduces it.
Right. I think the colorblindness is part of that kind of matrix that we were talking about earlier, of the belief that there is this universal democracy, and that capital D, and that all people have the same relationship to this, and that if we just simply establish this rule, we will all kind of have the same experience. But it doesn't wind up that way. Like, there's no data that actually points to that. As a matter of fact, the data points to the opposite, and it's a kind of willful refusal of us to engage with it. But then we wind up saying, just like the people with Newton, we were saying we keep getting these findings that aren't in accord with what we believe. It can't be that the theory is wrong. It has to be that there's some other thing that's there, because we have a particular kind of emotional attachment to viewing the world in these colorblind terms. But there has certainly been this rise, over years, that is not unrelated. I think the acceleration of this is not unrelated to the presence of a black person in the White House. And so one of the things that happened, we could just kind of make a historical comparison. In 1964, during the contentious debates around the Civil Rights Act of that year, there was a senator from Alabama by the name of J. Lister Hill. He was opposed to the Civil Rights Act. And he took to the floor of the Senate, he made an argument, he said, I do not believe in the extension of special privileges or rights to any part of American society. And on its face, that sounds like an actual defense of the Civil Rights Act. Sure, we should not give one group in society more rights than we give to another group in society. But he's actually arguing very much akin to the D.W. Griffith idea around intolerance. He is arguing that by protecting black people's civil rights, you are giving them advantages over white people. Now, this was an outlier opinion coming from an Alabama senator in 1964. But what has happened is that the increasing presence, although far from proportional in society, the increasing presence of African Americans on university campuses, in corporate America, in more visibility in politics, in media and entertainment, has allowed people to indulge this idea that protecting the rights of black people actually constitutes an added privilege given to black people. And it is contrary to our idea of colorblindness, where we should all have the same rights at the same time. And so the kind of most recent example that we saw of this was in the Shelby versus Holder case, which struck down the protections of the Voting Rights Act, which said that essentially the burden wasn't around African American voters who have to have their right to vote protected. The burden was around Southern whites who had been unfairly stigmatized as racist. And so I think that the dynamics that we're talking about, that we see on college campuses, are just reflections. They're not particular to college campuses. They're just reflections of, maybe more visible reflections of the same dynamic in other parts of the society. You had a second part of your question. Right. Right, right, true. And I think that was, I think that is a kind of intergenerational dynamic. And I also think that part of this is very hard to reconcile. So when I taught for a semester in Moscow, and this was right after Obama had been elected. And so there were people who were saying, yes, okay, so you all are finished with this race thing, right? And I was like, not exactly. He's like, but you have a black president. Yeah. And I was like, but most of us are not the president. And so this is where it becomes complicated, and that it's possible for both of these things to exist at the same time. I don't know that we've done a good enough job of conveying that. And so, as a matter of fact, in this conversation that I had, where I was making reference to with our peers, I actually said that some of this is on our shoulders for not having adequately equipped people. Now, perhaps we were too cynical. I'm open to the idea, although I don't necessarily think we were, but I think that there was not enough transmitted to another generation about how race might actually confront you. And so for me, growing up in a household with two parents who had migrated to New York from Alabama and Georgia, they had very, very low expectations for what interaction with the white world and white institutions would yield, just being very frank. I think that is part of the dynamic that we've seen emerging in the past year and a half as well. There were some questions up here in the blue. Someone tell me I'm wrong. I'm open to that. You know, my daughter does this
I'll
quite
try to do
frequently.
that.
Okay.
Kurt, I'm a Brown alumnus, and first off, thanks for coming to speak.
Mhm.
It was a fantastic lecture. So I think that you make a really good point about sharpening the sword, and I think that is an incredibly valuable educational exercise. But there's a flip side to even allowing people that advocate for slavery to speak or something like that, and that by allowing them to speak, we inherently give them a platform and enable the structures that they create. I mean, a lot of people theorize, and some people are studying the effects of Donald Trump's rhetoric on interracial violence and things like that, even in the current era. And so how, I guess the question is what guidelines would you offer to navigate that that difference between, right, when do you give people a platform? And I think the other thing to add, I think, is that a lot of people that they've staked their political career on some racist agenda, like if I can say stop and frisk in New York, for example, where somebody isn't going to be open to rethinking their perspective because they have some kind of capital or interest in their perspective. So when do you say, okay, we should have this debate, and when do you say, okay, this debate is hopeless, and by having these words spoken is just encouraging the problem?
So there's that saying, I don't remember who to attribute it to, but they say never argue with a fool because they'll drag you down to their level and beat you with experience. And so there is that element of it. There is a certain point at which this becomes fruitless. And you outline the exact point at which it becomes fruitless. As a matter of fact, in the conversation earlier today, those were the contours of the conversation, saying that some of this is amenable to kind of intellectual exchange and dialogue, but a great deal of the progress that's been made in the society happened because it was in people's self-interest or because they had no other choice, not because they had been won over by an intellectual argument. So when we look at the civil rights movement, it's not coincidental that the kind of upsurge of it happens at the same upsurge of the Cold War. The United States has historically been, as a constitutional democracy, intensely concerned about its public appearance abroad. And so having its contradictions, its racial contradictions, highlighted by the Soviet Union was actually a liability. The existence of the Cold War made racism expensive, whereas there has previously been very few punitive elements of it, it became expensive in that context, especially when you're trying to establish diplomatic relationships with other countries that are constituted by people of color. And they're looking and going like, wow, you treat those black people really bad. Why should we have good trade relations with you? But why should we anticipate anything but bad treatment from you? And so I think that those things are real. But I do think that there is perhaps a middle ground wherein by stating your cause and stating your cause repeatedly and consistently, you can help hasten those points in which it becomes in someone's self-interest to act on your behalf. And so, it's kind of amazing too, like even the language we have around it. Like when we talk about at the end of the Civil War, there's this exchange between Martin R. Delaney, who's an African-American leader who had helped to rally black people to the cause of the war, and this white former Union official who says, yes, you have been given your freedom, your people have been given their freedom, which completely erases the fact that the freedom had been taken in the first place. And so we talk about this as if it was kind of bestowed upon people, like, hey, we have decided to give you back the thing that we stole from you in the first place. Now, give us great acclaim for it. And so, because we have that kind of confusion, it sometimes takes a long time. You sometimes have to articulate this idea again and again and again, and people recognize that, well, it's in our interests, as it was emancipation. People saying, well, Lincoln, who was confronted, the virtue of Lincoln is not that he was this kind of blameless, faultless, completely pure avatar of democracy. The virtue of Lincoln is that he's somebody who looked and said, I can have racism or I can have a country. I'll choose the country. Or I can have slavery or I can have a country. I'll choose the country, which is not guaranteed. There are plenty of other people who are in the North who'd say, I'm sorry, I'll take slavery. If you give me a choice between subordinating black people and the integrity of the United States, I'm going to choose subordinating black people. And so that's the virtue of that. But at the same time, this is a question of pure self-interest. His virtue is that he could actually recognize where his self-interest lay. And so I think that in many of these instances, we engage, and I don't think that this is making a superhuman request, a superhuman commitment to it, that we all have our particular boundaries or thresholds where which you say you don't feel that it's useful, the point of diminishing returns. I'm not engaging with this person doesn't get anywhere, it's not moving the ball. But I still think that you have to engage. And to the first part about letting people speak, I think you have to let people speak. Simply in the interest of having, if there's ignorance, then I have enough faith that eventually over time people will recognize ignorance for what it is, which is a pure decision to be optimistic about this. But if you don't allow people to speak, if you shout people down, they still wind up speaking. They still wind up speaking, but now they speak as a person who has been persecuted. And they speak with a particular kind of moral authority that they're granted by that, or appear to be granted by that. Wow, we got a bunch of people. Just whoever, you can go, you're down here.
Hi, my name is Alessio. I'm a graduate student here at Brown, and I have a question regarding the role universities should play moving forward in this dialogue. I'm concerned over the use of power in these dynamics where well-intentioned activists have had, historically, we talked about recently some of the events across the country, to silence opposing viewpoints which on a number of lines of argument, as you said, are completely ridiculous. But I'm concerned about the opposite, exactly what you just said.
Not quite what I said, but we were saying, go continue.
Well, I'm just really in the heart of what you said is that once you take away that platform from them, they can argue from a point of moral authority as the persecuted. And that's why I'm curious as to what your thoughts are on letting these ideas die in the free market of ideas as opposed to creating a institutionalized regulation of private conversation and essentially private action on campus, and how then maybe does that correlate to other functions outside of that?
Yeah, no. Here's the thing, right? These ideas don't die in the free market of ideas. They are killed sometimes, but they don't in and of themselves die. And there has to be sometimes institutional authority levied in order to make these things happen. It's like the argument that people make that slavery would have died out eventually. Yeah, well, okay. After 2 or 3 or 4 more generations of people had been enslaved, maybe, but people had to actually challenge that. And so I do think that there is a difference and there is a boundary between saying, I disagree, or I have a viewpoint that you find offensive, and that I'm actually working in service of things that marginalize and exploit and oppress people. And so when we talked about the conflict around Charlie Hebdo, for instance, and lots of people saw, like, okay, what happened to these writers was horrendous. That should never have happened. There is no defense for what happened to them. But it was important to draw a distinction for many of us between the moral abhorrence for the attack upon these writers with validating what the writers themselves were doing, knowing that by ridiculing Islam, it's not simply a competition among equals, is ridiculing a group that is marginalized in French society, that we have even now people are wearing, going to beaches and arresting women for wearing what they deem to be, was the burkini, I think they were calling it, or that women cannot wear veils, or that there are these actual dynamics that work to the social and political and economic marginalization of this population. And in that case, you wind up punching down. That's what you're doing. And I don't think that we should pretend that those things are not connected in some way, shape, and form. Like, we understand that propaganda has an actual function, and propaganda actually has consequences. And that's the difference between what D.W. Griffith saw. He's saying, I'm making a film, you can't trample upon my right to make a film. And the NAACP saying, no, the people who are watching your film are actually killing us. You're talking about an abstract principle, and we're talking about our ability to live. And so I think that you don't have a kind of neutral institution in that case. Like, we find there is a parameter, and we can define that. That's where there can be a debate about where those parameters lie, or where those lines are. But to simply say that we will just say, oh, okay, well, I believe that black people are intellectually inferior. Let's have a debate about that. When you're on a campus where there are hardly any black people, you have a hard time retaining those who do come. Yeah, no, that's not quite the same. Another thing that I find about this is that we often have this conversation is on the terms of the marginalized people. Like, we never have a debate, we're saying, let's go up to heterosexual people and say, prove that you should be able to marry. You know, defend your right to marry. Because it's absurd. We wouldn't question it. If we did actually have that debate, it wouldn't correlate to anything that actually happens in the world. Because when you walk out of the room as a heterosexual person, you are still going to be able to live your life without the threat of violence or fear of alienation or ostracization or any of those things that gays and lesbians have to confront in society. I think that's the difference, recognizing that these are not equal terms of debate, and that we are relativistic. And maybe even in grappling with that simple recognition is the best I think I can hope for in terms of us finding what some sort of fair middle ground might look like. Okay. Mm-hmm. He had his hand up actually the longest, and the gray jacket gentleman right here. Yeah, you.
Thank you. My name is David Kim. I teach down the road at Connecticut College.
Okay.
Maybe on that last note, and about kind of the culture's democracy,
Mm-hmm.
you know, and so maybe in response to what you were saying about the kind of pessimistic optimism, I can't quite remember what you were saying there, about, you know, the ambivalence we have around democracy. You know, so like, do we treat each other as equals, even though in a thoroughly hierarchical society, right? And sort of, you know, how do we grapple with that? You know, where there's a real ambivalence about our investments and our continuing investments in a process and a culture that breaks down with more consistency than it meets our expectations.
Right. I think that's difficult. And so there's this conversation around American exceptionalism that we have, and I think it's the most toxic thing. And the reason I think that is that I keep saying this. I said this on Twitter earlier today with someone. It was like that being exceptional is like being wealthy or good looking, which is that it's better for other people to say that about you than for you to say that about yourself, you know? And so I think that is also corrosive in a particular way. Like, the biggest barrier to actually being exceptional is thinking of yourself as that. That, you know, you become blind to your own shortcomings. So if there are things about the society that are laudable, you know, I was part of a media panel last July 4th, where people always think that people on the left hate America, right? And so this discussion was like, one thing that you name one thing that you love about America. And I said public libraries. And I forget how many thousands of public libraries. There's an absurd number of public libraries in this country. And it is an amazing testament to these places that you can just walk in. You don't have to have any money. You can walk in and learn things. I think that is a principle that reflects well upon, there's an institution that reflects well upon our principles. But I don't want to say, like, because we have this fantastic number of public libraries, we shut down conversations around mass incarceration, saying we have the largest incarcerated population in the Western world. And so we're so busy talking about the exceptionalism of our public library system that we can't countenance all these other things that become shortcomings. And I think it's just a matter of maturity. It's a matter of social, intellectual, and moral maturity to grapple with that. Even as we kind of think of ourselves, we like to think of ourselves as good people, but we have shortcomings. All of us have shortcomings, and we don't think of those shortcomings as being ideally in a kind of healthy outlook. We don't think of those shortcomings as being the cancellation of the things that are good about us. We have things that we can work on, and we look at the things we've done well and hopefully use that as a basis for working on things that we need to change. I think that is really, when we talk about the threats to American democracy, and if I just put my cards on the table and we talk about this election, what frightens me the most is the kind of jingoistic reference to making America great again, and greatness being associated in these terms that are none of them are things that we I think in a democratic society should think about as great, as mostly bluster and swagger and kind of the ability to intimidate people on the world stage. I think that if we were going to make America great again, we would actually talk about doing things like creating a living wage and diminishing the number of people in a society who are incarcerated, and making education affordable, and making a society such that one's gender or race or ethnicity does not correlate to your life outcomes, to these things where we actually have a society where we make it easy for people to vote, kind of fundamental cornerstone things. And I think at that point, that is actually what makes you look more like an exceptional society than you currently do. Thank you.
Thank you. That was fantastic, Jelani, really fantastic. The purpose of this series was to have exactly this kind of conversation, is to be able to actually talk about these things, those boundary issues, and as a community really engage in them. And I think that Professor Cobb did an amazing job. We have a whole series of other people coming to speak. It's on the other side of today's pamphlet, so I really hope that you do make it. We have people from very different perspectives, talking about more or less the same issues, and I hope to see you at those sessions as well. Please join me in thanking Professor Cobb for a really fantastic